Minister, the Venezuelan political scientist Eduardo Lander wrote of the current climate crisis, and he said the total failure of climate negotiation serves to highlight the extent to which we now live in a post-democratic society. The interests of financial capital and the oil industry are much more important than the democratic will of the people around the world. In the global neoliberal society, profit is more important than life. That's a very profound statement, and I have to say it will be utterly vindicated in the context of this bill unless it is dramatically stood on its head than its present very shoddy format that it has been brought before this House. Now, as many deputies have already highlighted, there are 5 glaring deficiencies in the proposed bill, and a bigger problem in terms of the way in which we're looking at climate change, full stop. Firstly, as the other deputies have said, it doesn't set a simple emission target for 2050. How can you measure progress if you don't know what you're starting out with? No definition of a low carbon economy. Clearly, whatever you're having yourself more or less approach that the government is adopting. I think other deputies have referred to the fact that the bill as it stands doesn't allow the Expert Advisory Council to be fully independent. And we've had enough of political interference potentially in so many aspects of the state. We certainly don't need it in this regard, or that such a body would be at the whim of the majority political grouping of the day, particularly when we're dealing with the situation where the interests of the powerful are generally diametrically opposed to the interests of the rest of humanity. And I think this is one of the problems when we look at this. It's not a case of balancing interests or a rising tide lifts all boats. The root of the climate change problem is that the interests of the wealthy are opposed to the interests of the majority. And unless you factor that in dealing with climate change, it will not be done appropriately. I think the other deputies have dealt very well with the points about climate justice being entirely absent from the bill. I mean, it's a scandalous situation for a country like Ireland that prided itself on its benevolence around the world and its neutrality and so on, that we are one of the worst polluters per capita in the world. And if you like, we've benefited from the gross exploitation of others. Those who are suffering the most are actually the least to blame about this situation. And we have to acknowledge that we are responsible for our role in some of the poorest countries in the world who are actually fighting for their existence as we speak. And I think, obviously, as other deputies have said, one of the most cowardly aspects of this bill is that it passes it on to the next government, which is, to be honest, becoming a real ploy of this government. You're going to do nothing and tackle nothing. Everything is for the responsibility of the next government, which will lead many people into thinking, what's the point in having you here in the first place? Because the deadline for the next climate plan is 2017. Already this plan is years too late. We won't even now have a plan. It's a situation of, if you like, putting us in the context of being internationally humiliated. But again, international humiliation is kind of par for the course as well, when we're quite happy to parade this country as one which is happy to ignore human rights law, to violate human rights in despite of all the best advice. So I suppose we'd be a bit naive if we expected anything more in terms of an approach on climate change as well. Now, I think we have to radically stand things on their head, but I think we have to start by saying that we have to achieve targets by 2020, 2030, 2050, targets to which we have a direct and legally binding obligation, apart from a moral one as well. And, you know, we have to stand on its head the way we do things. And to me, the problem with the approach we've taken was absolutely summed up by the points made by Deputy O'Dowd. It's all our fault. The fact that I'm going to get home and drive home in my car is my fault, that I'm not going to cycle out to Swords, or I'm not going to get the bus, a bus route that has been absolutely decimated under this government, that should take me about an hour and a half to even get home. It wasn't practical for people living in this city to be able to manage on a system that has been fatally underinvested on. You can't run a city on private cars, but that's what many people have been driven into because of the consistency persistent lack of subvention for public transport, the lack of delivery of a decent rail infrastructure to our airport and beyond, to one of the fastest growing areas in Europe, as it were. So get on your bike doesn't actually work in the context of some of the policies that this government has put forward. And I find it a bit sickening that Deputy O'Dowd has no problem in entertaining Shell, one of the biggest polluters on the planet, and yet wants us all driving around in electric cars, entertaining fracking and then blaming ordinary people for, if you like, the crisis. It's just not good enough. This is why, and one of the reasons why we're in the situation that we are. We need a complete overhaul of how we do everything, and that does start with planning and the interconnection between government departments. Now, we say these things on paper, that we're going to have sustainable communities, but instead we build them in a format that leaves people with no alternative but to get into a car. We perpetuate policies over decades where multi-millions, billions have been put into road transport. Even now, tens of millions are given to national toll roads to pay for that setup, when we're under-investing in public transport, the likes of which no other European economy has done. It does mean looking at our planning system, building schools and local facilities near where people live. There's no point building housing estates in the middle of nowhere with no public transport and then blaming parents for having to get into a car to bring their kids to school. All of these things must be integrated. We do need to look at a land management strategy that discourages sprawl and encourages local low-energy forms of agriculture and so on. And I think Naomi Klein does sum it up very well when she says we need to be fair so that the people already struggling to cover the basics are not being asked to make additional sacrifices to offset the excessive consumption of the rich. And that's at the heart of this. We talk about the polluter pays, and that's a very important concept. But in Ireland, that has been bastardised to meaning attacking ordinary people and ignoring the fact that it's actually the wealthy in society who are the biggest polluters. According to the Princeton Environmental Institute, the top 500 million richest people on earth are responsible for over half of the world's carbon emissions. That's where we have to start if we're going to have any meaningful issues on this. And progressive taxation, which taxes the millionaires and billionaires, has climate justice at its heart. Now, we don't have enough time to debate the points, but the development of renewable energy, particularly in the area of wave power in the context of Ireland, will not be done by the private sector. The state has to grab this issue by the helm and lead. We have maybe 10 companies trying to develop prototypes at the moment. They're all too small. It's not a viable operation for them. We need to buy the intellectual property rights from those people, employ them, and then go for it, because the private sector won't do it. We need a little bit of the vision that we had when the ESB was set up all those years ago. They have engineers. We need to put many more into that. But we need to be doing that and not, if you like, wasting our time on the likes of fracking or nuclear energy and so on. We do need a radical shift, because we are at a tipping point. We need to look at how society is organised. And jobs is, climate change is an issue which is in the interests of people. It's the clumsy handling of this in areas that has alienated people. We do need to devolve it locally, but we also need to see that climate action is a massive job creator. And a little bit like the project that's been promoted in South Africa, where they go under the banner of 1 million climate jobs, calling for a massive job creation programme in areas such as renewable energy, to public transport, to ecosystem restoration, to small-scale sustaining farming. These issues can put the interests of workers and the poor at the head of a movement to combat climate change. And it's a win-win for everybody except those at the top of society, the 1% who are, if you like, dominating in their own interests at the expense of us all. And unless this government and its peers across Europe and America are going to tackle that issue and tackle inequality, then you can't tackle climate change. It's going to be absolutely impossible. So while, if you like, warning about the glaring inefficiencies here, we do need to stand on its head the way in which we approach these issues and how society is organised, rather than blaming ordinary people for a crisis which is demonstrably not of their making.
Thank you, Deputy.